I traced the signature on the cashier's check, the amount $28,000/$100, feeling heavier than the paper it was printed on. This wasn't just money, it was vindication, a final, satisfying period at the end of a very long, very ugly sentence. But to understand how I got this check, we have to go back to the beginning. 5 years ago, I poured every cent I had and a good chunk of what the bank was willing to lend me into a small house on a half-acre of land. The house itself was nothing special, a simple 2-bedroom bungalow that needed new paint and a lot of love, but the land was my dream. It was a perfect rectangle of green, dotted with old-growth oak trees and backing up to a quiet, undeveloped patch of woods. For a freelance graphic designer who spent 10 hours a day staring at a screen, it was a sanctuary. My work is my life. I'm one of those people who genuinely loves what they do. I live and breathe color palettes, typography, and the clean, satisfying lines of a perfectly balanced logo. My clients are demanding, with impossible deadlines and vague feedback like, "Can you make it pop more?" I'd spend nights fueled by coffee, tweaking the kerning on a font by 1/100th of a point, or adjusting the hue of a background image until it was just right. My dedication paid off. I had a steady stream of work and a reputation for being meticulous. That same meticulous nature was why I'd chosen this property. I had the survey documents from my purchase memorized. I knew exactly where my property lines were, marked by the iron pins sunk into the earth decades ago. My land was my space, the one place where every blade of grass was mine, a quiet buffer zone against the chaos of the world and the demands of my clients. For the first year, it was bliss. Then the house next door sold. My new neighbor was a man named Mark. He was a loud, overly friendly guy in his late 40s, with a booming laugh and a handshake that felt more like a power play. He was always out in his yard, always waving, always making a comment. At first, it seemed harmless, just a typical neighborly routine. I remember one Saturday morning in early spring. I was on my small back patio, nursing a cup of tea and sketching ideas for a new branding project in my notebook. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and new leaves. It was peaceful. Mark's voice cut through the quiet like a chainsaw. "Morning, neighbor," he bellowed from his side of the ancient rickety wire fence that separated our properties. I managed a tight smile. "Morning, Mark." He ambled over, his boots crunching on stray leaves. "Working hard or hardly working?" he asked, peering over at my sketchbook. "A little of both," I said, closing the book. My ideas felt private, and his gaze felt intrusive. Right. Hey, listen," he said, leaning his forearms on a wobbly fence post. "I was looking at that big oak of yours, the one closest to us." He pointed. "A few of those lower branches are hanging way over my lawn, blocks the morning sun in my kitchen. You mind if I get in there and trim 'em back a bit? Clean it up for you?" It sounded like a favor, but his tone was off. It wasn't a question so much as a declaration of what he was about to do. I felt a prickle of unease. That oak was one of my favorites, and I was fiercely protective of it. "I'd rather you didn't, actually," I said, keeping my voice even. "I like the shade it provides, and if it needs trimming, I'll hire a professional arborist to make sure the tree stays healthy." Mark's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A flicker of annoyance flashed in his eyes before being replaced by that mask of over-the-top friendliness. Sure. No sweat. Just trying to be helpful, you know? He patted the wooden fence post, making it wobble precariously. "This old thing's about to fall over anyway," he chuckled. "Barely tells you where your yard ends and mine begins." He winked, then turned and walked back toward his house, whistling. I stood there for a long time after he left, the pleasant morning air suddenly feeling cold. His last comment hung in the air, a casual, throwaway line that felt anything but. It wasn't just about a fence, it was a test. He was probing, checking to see if I was paying attention to the boundaries. I had a sinking feeling in my stomach that this was only the beginning, and that my quiet little sanctuary was about to be invaded. My sinking feeling proved to be a prophetic one. For the next 2 years, Mark's casual disregard for boundaries escalated. It was a slow, creeping invasion. A few feet of his lawn clippings blown onto my side of the fence, his dog, unleashed, digging holes in my flower beds, a new, garish floodlight installed on the side of his house, aimed directly at my bedroom window. Each time I tried to address it, I was met with that same disarming, overly friendly smile. "Oh, sorry about that, won't happen again." But it always did. It was a war of attrition, and my once peaceful sanctuary was starting to feel like a battlefield. The real betrayal, the act that shattered any pretense of neighborly civility, happened on a Tuesday in October. I had been completely swamped, working on a massive rebranding project for a tech company. It was the kind of job that required my undivided attention. 3 straight days of all-nighters, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the looming pressure of a non-negotiable deadline. I barely left my desk, let alone my house. On Wednesday morning, after finally emailing the finished project files, I felt like I could breathe again. I decided to reward myself with a walk around my property, to reconnect with the green space I'd been neglecting. I stepped out onto my back patio, stretched my arms toward the sky, and froze. The world had tilted on its axis. The air felt thin, the light too bright. Where the magnificent, sprawling canopy of my 3 largest oaks used to stand near the property line, there was just sky, an empty, gaping void. My gaze dropped to the ground. Stumps. 3 of them. Massive, pale, freshly cut circles of wood, looking like giant weeping wounds in the earth. The ground around them was a disaster zone of sawdust, tire tracks, and crushed grass. A wave of nausea washed over me. I walked, trance-like, toward the destruction. My beautiful, century-old oaks, the very reason I bought this property, gone. "Morning!" Mark's voice boomed from his side of the yard, sickeningly cheerful. He was standing by the stumps, hands on his hips, admiring his handiwork. A bright yellow chainsaw sat on the ground near his feet. "What did you do?" My voice was a choked whisper. "Clean things up," he announced proudly, gesturing to the open sky. "Told you I would. Look at all that sunlight you're getting now. I did you a favor." "A favor?" I finally found my voice, and it was shaking with a rage I didn't know I possessed. "Mark, those trees were on my property. They were worth a fortune." My mind, always meticulous, was already doing the math. An arborist I'd consulted for a minor, trimming 2 years prior, had casually valued each mature oak at a minimum of $10,000. He had just erased $30,000 of my property value in a single morning. Mark just laughed, a short, barking sound. "Your property? Don't be dramatic. That old fence is falling apart. The line is fuzzy. Besides, they were messy, dropping leaves all over my new patio set." He kicked at a piece of bark. "It's just trees. You can plant new ones." "You can't just cut down someone else's trees," I yelled, tears of fury and disbelief stinging my eyes. "I'm going to have to get a surveyor out here again, and a lawyer. You're going to pay for this." His friendly mask finally dropped completely. His face hardened, and his eyes narrowed into 2 cold, dark slits. He took a step toward me, his posture suddenly menacing. "Listen here," he said, his voice low and guttural. "You sit inside all day staring at a screen. You don't even use this land. I'm out here every day, making it nice." He looked me up and down, a dismissive sneer twisting his lips. "A little thing like you. What do you need with all this space anyway? You don't deserve it." His words hit me harder than a physical blow. It wasn't just about the trees or the property line anymore. It was a fundamental violation, a statement that my ownership, my very presence here, was illegitimate in his eyes. I felt so completely alone in that moment, standing in the wreckage of my sanctuary. It's a feeling I'm sure some of you watching have experienced, that sense of being utterly powerless. It's why sharing these stories is so important. If you're just finding my channel, I hope you'll subscribe so you don't miss what happened next. Because I wasn't about to let him be right. I wasn't going to let him win. I stumbled back into my house, the slam of the patio door echoing the frantic beat of my own heart. His final words, "You don't deserve it," circled in my head like vultures. For a few hours, I just sat at my kitchen table, staring out at the brutalized landscape. Rage is a hot, sharp thing, but what came after was a cold, heavy dread. He was right about one thing. I did spend my days staring at a screen. I solved problems with logic, with grids and guidelines, with clearly defined parameters. This was chaos. This was a violation that logic couldn't simply undo. But I was a meticulous person. I had to try. I had to follow the proper steps to believe that reason could still prevail. Yelling and crying had gotten me nowhere. Maybe facts would. The next afternoon, after a sleepless night spent listening to the wind whistle through the new, empty space where my trees used to be, I armed myself. I pulled out the thick folder from my home purchase, the deed, the title report, and most importantly, the official land survey neatly folded. I smoothed it out on the table, my finger tracing the bold, undeniable line that marked the boundary between my property and his. The 3 oaks, represented by small circles on the map, were situated a full 10 feet on my side. It was irrefutable. Clutching the document like a shield, I took a deep breath and walked over to his house. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced my feet to keep moving. He was in his garage, organizing a set of gleaming new tools on a pegboard. "Mark," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He turned, a wrench in his hand. The aggressive sneer from yesterday was gone, replaced by a look of weary impatience, as if I were a fly he'd already swatted once. "I'd like to talk to you about the trees," I began, holding up the survey. "I wanted to show you this. It's the official survey of the properties. I think there's been a misunderstanding about the property line." I stepped forward, unfolding the large paper and holding it out for him to see. "You can see here," I pointed, my finger shaking slightly. "The boundary is marked by these iron pins. The oaks were well within my property." I kept my tone level, factual. This wasn't an accusation. It was a presentation of evidence. An arborist valued those trees at over $30,000, Mark. That's a significant loss of my property value. I'm hoping we can resolve this between us without getting lawyers involved. I'm asking you to cover the cost of the damages. For a moment, he just stared at the paper. I allowed a flicker of hope, maybe seeing it in black and white, the official seal, the surveyor's signature. Maybe that would be enough. Then he laughed. It wasn't his usual booming, overly friendly laugh. It was a short, sharp, ugly sound, full of contempt. He didn't even bother to look closely at the document I held. "You're serious?" he scoffed, tossing the wrench onto his workbench with a clatter. "You come over here with your little map, and you think I'm going to write you a check for 30 grand? For a bunch of dirty, overgrown trees?" He took a step toward me, invading my space, forcing me to step back. "I don't give a damn about your piece of paper. I've been mowing right up to those trees for 2 years. That's my yard. You want to talk about the law? Possession is 9/10 of it, sweetheart." "That's not how it works," I stammered, my carefully constructed composure crumbling. "The survey is the legal document." "The legal document is that you're a pain in my ass," he snapped, his voice dropping low again. "I did you a favor. I improved the neighborhood. You should be sending me a thank you card, not waving paperwork in my face. You're not getting a dime, not one. Now get off my property before I call the cops for harassment." He turned his back on me, dismissing me as if I were nothing more than a gnat. He picked up his wrench and went back to his pegboard, whistling that same infuriating tune from the day he'd first mentioned the branches. I stood there, frozen, the survey clutched in my fist. The paper felt flimsy, useless, a child's drawing of a world that no longer existed. All my logic, my proof, my attempt at a reasonable adult conversation, it had all just bounced off his wall of sheer, arrogant certainty. He hadn't just rejected my offer, he had rejected my reality. He had looked at the truth and laughed. A profound and terrifying sense of isolation washed over me. It was the feeling of screaming into a vacuum. The law, the rules, the simple decency I had naively believed undergirded everything. None of it mattered to him. He saw me as a little thing, a sweetheart, an emotional woman with a silly piece of paper. He had sized me up and decided I was powerless. And in that moment, as I walked back to my empty yard, the silence of my felled oak screaming at me, I was terrified he might be right. The world suddenly felt lawless, a place where the loudest, most aggressive man wins. That was my low point, the bottom of the pit he had dug for me. The moment I truly understood that my quiet, reasonable world had been burned to the ground. I walked back to my house in a daze, the crumpled survey a testament to my own naivete. The world I understood, a world of contracts and clearly defined lines, had evaporated. In its place was Mark's world, where truth was determined by the volume of your voice and the smugness of your sneer. He had built his reality on top of mine, and his was winning. That night, sleep was a stranger. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves in the now barren patch of my yard sounded like his mocking laughter. I felt a primal fear I'd never known, the fear of being erased. The next morning, I sat at my desk, my graphic design monitor dark. I couldn't work. I couldn't focus on color palettes or typography when the world outside my window had been rendered in brutal, ugly strokes. His words kept playing on a loop. Possession is 9/10 of it, sweetheart. The condescension was infuriating, but the phrase itself snagged in my meticulous brain. It was a legal-sounding cliché, the kind of thing people say when they don't know what they're talking about. But what if he thought he was right? What was the other 1/10? My fingers, almost of their own accord, moved to the keyboard. I was a researcher by nature. My job was to dive into the minutiae of a client's industry, to understand their audience, to find the perfect visual language. I decided to apply that same obsessive focus to this. I wasn't looking for a fight anymore, I was looking for a fact. I started with property line disputes, then tree law in my state. I waded through dense legal articles, forum posts from angry homeowners, and the dry, impenetrable text of state statutes. For hours, it was a blur of terms: encroachment, trespass, private nuisance. Everything seemed to confirm what I already knew. He was in the wrong. But it all led back to the same place: a confrontation, a lawsuit, a he said, she said battle where he would just laugh and lie. I needed something he couldn't laugh away. I needed something cold, hard, and mathematical. It was deep into the afternoon, my eyes burning from the screen, when I stumbled into a different corner of property law. I was reading a case summary on a legal blog about a commercial property dispute, a gas station that had accidentally paved a parking lot 5 feet onto the neighboring business's land. The owner of the business didn't just sue for the removal of the asphalt, he sued for something else. A term I'd never seen before jumped off the page: mesme profits. I typed it into the search bar. The definition that appeared made my breath catch in my throat. Mesne profits are damages for the wrongful occupation of land, typically calculated as the property's fair rental value for the period of the defendant's wrongful possession. Wrongful occupation, fair rental value. His words came back to me again, but this time they sounded different. I've been mowing right up to those trees for 2 years. That's my yard. He hadn't just trespassed once to cut down my trees. He had been trespassing continuously. He had been using my land. He had admitted it. He had bragged about it. A slow, cold fire started to burn in my chest, replacing the heavy dread. This wasn't just about the $30,000 value of the trees anymore. That was a one-time act of destruction. This was bigger. This was a continuous, quantifiable theft of my property itself. I jumped up from my desk and grabbed the survey, spreading it out on the floor. This time, it wasn't a flimsy shield. It was an architect's blueprint. I found the iron pins marking the true boundary. Then I went to the window. looking out at the yard with new eyes. I could see it clearly now. The line where the grass he mowed was a slightly different height. The corner where his new, expensive-looking patio set sat, its back legs resting a good 3 feet on my side of the line. The area where he had worn a path walking from his back door to the trees he'd destroyed. I grabbed a tape measure from my utility drawer and marched outside. I didn't care if he saw me. Let him. I measured the depth of the encroachment, nearly 4 feet along the entire 80-foot length of the fence. I measured the square footage his patio occupied on my land. I took photos of everything: the patio legs on my grass, the worn path, the difference in lawn height. Back inside, I opened a new document on my computer, a spreadsheet this time. I calculated the total square footage of my land he had been occupying, 320 square feet. Then I started a new search, average commercial land lease rates per square foot in my county. The number I found was modest, but when I multiplied it by 320 square feet, and then by 24 months, the figure on my screen began to grow. I added a new line item: destruction of 3 mature oak trees. I put $30,000 in the cell next to it. Then I added another: back rent for illegal occupation and use of 320 square featuring of private land. The number the spreadsheet calculated was just over $6,000. And he was still using it every day. The meter was still running. I leaned back in my chair, a feeling I hadn't felt in days washing over me. Control. He had laughed at my little map. He had dismissed the value of my trees as a matter of opinion. But this was different. This wasn't emotion. This was math. This was the language of business, of rent, of leases. It was a bill, an invoice for services rendered against my will. He thought possession was 9/10 of the law. I had just discovered the other 1/10, and it was going to cost him. The spreadsheet glowed on my screen, a grid of stark, beautiful logic. It was the most satisfying design I'd ever created. For the first time since I'd seen the stumps, the frantic, helpless buzzing in my head went quiet. The dread was gone, replaced by a cold, clear focus. This was a language Mark would have to understand, not because it was fair or right, but because it was measured in dollars and cents. My plan required a new kind of discipline. He had called me a little thing who sits inside all day. Fine, I would become a ghost. I complied with his demand to get off his property, and by his definition, that included the 10-foot wide strip of my own land he'd claimed. When I saw his car pull into his driveway, I moved away from the window. When I heard his booming voice in his backyard, I closed my patio door. I stopped tending to the flower beds near the property line. I let the grass grow a little longer there. To him, it must have looked like a retreat, a surrender. He probably thought he had finally broken me, that I had accepted my place as the quiet, defeated woman next door. He had no idea that my silence was not submission. It was preparation. My days were now split in two. From 9 to 5, I was a graphic designer, meticulously aligning logos and choosing fonts for clients who wanted things to pop. But my evenings belonged to a new project, case file number 734AC, as I'd labeled the folder on my desktop. I organized my evidence with the same obsessive detail I'd give a corporate branding guide. The survey was scanned and annotated. The photos of his patio furniture on my land were time-stamped and labeled. I created a timeline of his escalating encroachments. I even found the 2-year-old email from the arborist with his casual valuation of the oaks. And at the center of it all was my spreadsheet, my beautiful, damning invoice. After a week of this silent preparation, I started searching for a lawyer. I didn't want a bulldog from a billboard. I wanted a sniper. I researched local attorneys who specialized in real estate and property law, reading through their case histories and client reviews. I found him on the 3rd page of my search, a man named Arthur Vance. His website was simple, text-based, and brutally efficient. He had a reputation for being dry, methodical, and utterly ruthless when it came to the letter of the law. He was perfect. I walked into his quiet, book-lined office, feeling like I was presenting a final project for review. I didn't cry or raise my voice. I I simply opened my laptop and walked him through my presentation. I showed him the survey, the photos, the timeline. When I finally brought up the spreadsheet and explained the concept of Mesner profits, he leaned forward, his impassive face showing the first flicker of interest. He took off his glasses, polished them with a cloth, and looked from my spreadsheet back to me. "You calculated the fair rental value based on commercial lease rates?" he asked, his voice a low monotone. "It seemed the most objective metric," I said. "He's using my land, so I'm charging him rent." A slow, thin smile spread across Arthur Vance's face. It was the smile of a predator who has just been handed a map to a well-stocked hunting ground. "It's aggressive," he said, the smile widening slightly. "I like it. The tree valuation is solid, but the wrongful occupation claim, that's where we twist the knife." He admitted to it. He bragged about it. "It shows a pattern of intentional trespass, not a simple mistake." He put his glasses back on. "I'll take the case. We'll file a complaint for damages, trespass, destruction of timber, and illegal occupation. We'll ask for the full value of the trees, plus treble damages, as the statute allows for willful destruction, and every last cent of back rent you've calculated, plus interest." I felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled my knees. I wasn't screaming into a vacuum anymore. I had an amplifier. I signed the retainer agreement, and just like that, the mechanism was set. The gears of justice, slow and expensive as they were, had begun to turn. A few days later, I was outside in the late afternoon, taking a few supplementary photos Arthur had requested. I kept my back to Mark's yard, focusing my camera on the crushed grass near the stumps. I knew he was there. I could feel his eyes on me. "Still taking pictures of your dead trees?" His voice dripped with condescending amusement. He was standing on my land, right next to his patio set, arms crossed over his chest in a posture of pure, unadulterated ownership. "You've got to learn to let things go, sweetheart. Look on the bright side. I saved you a fortune on leaf bags." He chuckled, expecting me to flinch, to argue, to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I slowly lowered my camera and turned to face him. I didn't say a word. I just looked at him, at his smug face, at his patio furniture sitting on my property, at the man who thought he had won so completely. And then I smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It was small, private, and held a world of information he wasn't privy to. The confidence on his face wavered for a split second, a tiny crack in his armor of arrogance. He didn't understand my smile, and that unknowing was a poison I had just administered. He grunted, turned his back, and went inside. I stayed right where I was, my smile fading as I thought about the process server who would be knocking on his door in the morning. He was right. I did have to learn to let things go. And I was about to let the law go straight for his wallet. The courtroom was cold, sterile, and smelled faintly of floor wax and old paper. It was a place stripped of all personality, a perfect blank canvas for the truth. I sat beside Arthur Vance, my hands resting calmly on the polished wooden table in front of me. My heart was a steady, rhythmic drum, a stark contrast to the frantic hummingbird beat it had maintained for months. Across the aisle, Mark sat with his lawyer. He kept leaning in, whispering, a smug little smirk playing on his lips. He caught my eye once and gave a dismissive little headshake, as if this whole proceeding was a ridiculous waste of his valuable time. He still thought this was a game of neighborhood drama. He didn't understand that I had changed the rules, moved the game to an arena where his booming voice and arrogant posturing were worth less than nothing. This wasn't a trial by jury, it was a bench trial, just us and the judge. After weeks of motions, depositions, and filings, this was the day of judgment. All the evidence had been submitted, all the arguments made. Now we just had to listen. The judge, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression that reminded me of my most demanding clients, cleared her throat. The room fell silent. She looked down at the mountain of paperwork that was my life for the past few years. "I have reviewed all the submitted materials in the matter of this property dispute," she began, her voice even and devoid of emotion. She looked over her glasses directly at Mark. Let's first address the defendant's primary argument, which seems to be a colloquial understanding that possession is 9/10 of the law. Mark's smirk widened. He nudged his lawyer, proud that his core belief was being acknowledged. The judge's gaze hardened. Let me be unequivocally clear. That is a meaningless phrase. It is folk law, and it has no standing whatsoever in a court of actual law. What matters is the deed, the title, and the official survey, all of which are, in this case, irrefutably in the plaintiff's favor. The smirk on Mark's face vanished. It didn't crumble. It was simply wiped clean, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He sat up a little straighter. The judge continued, picking up my annotated survey map. The plaintiff has provided clear, convincing, and frankly, impeccably organized evidence. The survey from her purchase is unambiguous. The photographs of the defendant's patio furniture on her land are time-stamped. The defendant's own deposition, in which he admits to consistently maintaining the land up to the trees and claims it as his yard, serves not as a defense, but as a confession of long-term trespass. My breath caught. Arthur Vance gave a nearly imperceptible nod, his eyes fixed on the judge. Now to the damages, the judge said, turning a page. Regarding the 3 mature oak trees, willfully destroyed by the defendant, an act he also admitted to, framing it as a favor, the court does not find the defendant's assessment that they are just trees to be a credible valuation. Based on the testimony of a court-appointed certified arborist, the replacement and restoration value is determined to be $22,000. Mark flinched as if he'd been struck. He swiveled his head toward his lawyer, his face a mask of disbelief. His mouth opened, a protest forming, but his lawyer put a hand on his arm, shaking his head. $22,000? Mark hissed, his voice a hoarse whisper that carried across the silent room. For trees? The judge ignored him completely. Furthermore, she went on, and I felt a cold thrill run down my spine, we have the matter of the illegal occupation. The plaintiff has filed for Mesna profits, seeking compensation for the defendant's unauthorized use of her land. She looked at Mark again. In layman's terms, Mr. Mark's last name, you treated a 320-square-foot portion of your neighbor's property as your own for more than 2 years. You used it, you occupied it, and you derived benefit from it without permission and without payment. You were, in essence, a squatter. The law, therefore, requires you to pay rent for that occupation. This was it, the knife twist. The concept was so alien to his worldview that he couldn't seem to process it. His face was a bizarre canvas of shock and indignation. Rent? For a strip of grass he mowed? The court finds the plaintiff's calculation based on fair market rates for land use in the county to be reasonable, the judge declared. For the 24-month period of illegal occupation, damages are assessed at $6,000. She set her papers down. The silence in the room was absolute. Mark's face had gone from red to a sickly pale white. The numbers were sinking in. 22,000, 6,000. The smug, powerful man who had laughed at my little map was staring at a bill for $28,000. Therefore, the judge concluded, her voice ringing with finality, the court finds in favor of the plaintiff. Judgment is awarded in the total amount of $28,000 to be paid by the defendant. She banged her gavel once. The sound cracked through the tension like a gunshot. Chaos. Mark shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is insane," he yelled, his voice no longer a confident boom but a high, panicked shriek. "You can't! For some leaves and a patch of dirt? 28 grand? That's theft." "Mr. Mark's last name, control your client," the judge warned his lawyer, her eyes flashing with anger. But he was beyond control. The reality of what had happened had finally crashed through his wall of arrogance. He wasn't the king of the neighborhood anymore. He was just a man who had been handed a bill he couldn't afford, a consequence he couldn't bully his way out of. He looked at me then, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading fury. He saw me, truly saw me for the first time, not as a little thing, but as the architect of his ruin. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply met his gaze, my expression as calm and unreadable as the surface of a deep, cold lake. I stood, smoothed the front of my jacket, and shook Arthur Vance's offered hand. "Thank you," I said quietly. Then I turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving Mark to drown in the silence and the crushing mathematical weight of the justice he had so richly deserved. The heavy, suffocating dread I had carried for years finally lifted, replaced by the clean, quiet air of vindication. Walking away from the courthouse, I didn't feel elation. I didn't feel the giddy thrill of victory. I felt a profound, almost unnerving quiet. It was the same quiet I used to treasure on my back patio before Mark arrived, but this was different. This was a quiet I had fought for, paid for with sleepless nights and a constant grinding anxiety. It was the quiet of a debt settled. I spent the next 2 days in a strange limbo. I worked on my design projects, my focus sharper than it had been in years. The world outside my window, with its scarred earth and gaping sky, no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a monument to a battle won. I knew the judgment was just a piece of paper until it was paid, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I had faced him in the arena of his choosing, the world of aggression and dominance, and I had beaten him with the weapons of my own world, logic, evidence, and meticulous preparation. It was evening, a cool dusk settling over the neighborhood, when the knock came. It wasn't his usual confident hammering rap. It was a soft, hesitant tapping, like a bird hitting a window. I knew it was him. I opened the door and found a man I barely recognized. The arrogant, barrel-chested posture was gone. He was slumped, his shoulders caved in, his face a pasty, haggard gray. The smug sneer was replaced by the pinched, desperate lines of a man who has seen the bottom fall out of his world. Can I talk to you for a minute?" he mumbled, not meeting my eyes. He was looking at my doormat, my porch light, anywhere but at me. I didn't invite him in. I simply stood in the doorway, a silent, impassable barrier. "What about Mark?" The lawsuit," he stammered. "The money. $28,000. I can't." He finally looked up, and his eyes were wide with a frantic, pleading terror. "That will ruin me. We'll lose the house. Please." "You can't do this. I know I was a jerk. I know I messed up, but this is too much. We can work something out, right? A payment plan? I can pay for the trees. I get that. But the other stuff, the rent, it's not fair." I listened, my expression unchanged. All the fear he had instilled in me, all the condescension and dismissal he had heaped on me, it had all been distilled into this one pathetic, begging moment on my doorstep. I felt nothing, no pity, no anger, just the cold, clear finality of a transaction. The time to work something out was 2 years ago, when you wanted to trim my branches, I said, my voice level and calm. The second chance was when I came to your house with the survey, asking only for the cost of the trees. You laughed at me, Mark. You called me, sweetheart, and told me to get off your property. You made your choice. You chose to let a judge decide, and she did. But, he sputtered, searching for an argument that no longer existed. We can go back, tell them we've settled. We can. I cut him off. No, there is no we. The negotiation is over. The damages are set. I took a small, deliberate step forward, forcing him to take a half step back. The power dynamic had been irrevocably reversed. This is very simple now. The judge has ruled, pay me or the sheriff seizes your assets. The words hung in the cold air between us, as hard and heavy as stone. The color drained completely from his face. The mention of the sheriff, of tangible physical consequences beyond a piece of paper, made it real. He stared at me, the last flicker of hope dying in his eyes. He finally understood that I wasn't the little thing he could bully and dismiss. I was his creditor. What do you want from me? He whispered, his voice cracking. It was the sound of complete and and utter surrender. "I want a cashier's check for the full amount," I stated, my tone as crisp as a legal filing. "Not a personal check, not installments, one payment. You will deliver it to my lawyer's office by the end of the banking day, 1 week from today." I held his gaze, pinning him with the weight of his own actions. "You owe me $28,000. He just stood there, swaying slightly, a man hollowed out by the consequences he had so arrogantly invited. I had one last thing to say, one final closing statement to this ugly chapter. "Consider it a severance payment, Mark, for the end of this dispute. Once you pay the damages you owe, we will have nothing more to say to each other, ever." With that, I closed the door, the click of the lock sounding like the final gavel. I leaned against it, listening as his slow, shuffling footsteps faded away into the night. It was done. He had begged. He had broken. And I had dictated the terms of his defeat, not with a booming voice or a menacing posture, but with the quiet, unshakable power of the truth. The week that followed was the quietest of my life. I went about my work, my focus absolute, but a part of my mind was always listening, waiting. The deadline I had given Mark was a Friday. On Thursday afternoon, my phone rang. It was Arthur Vance. His voice was as dry and monotone as ever. "The check has arrived," he said, as if informing me of a routine shipment. "Cashier's check, as requested. You can pick it up at your convenience." I drove to his office, my hand steady on the steering wheel. He handed me the envelope without ceremony. Inside was the check, $28,000/$100. The bank's official font was crisp and impersonal. Mark's signature wasn't on it, of course, but his defeat was written all over it. This wasn't just money. It was a verdict, rendered in paper and ink. It was the full stop I had so desperately needed. 2 weeks later, a large moving truck rumbled down our street and parked in front of Mark's house. A "For Sale" sign was already hammered into his lawn, its bold red letters, a stark contrast to the wilting, neglected flower beds. I watched from my office window as he and his family loaded boxes into the truck. He looked smaller, diminished, his movements slow and heavy. He never once looked toward my house. His wife shot a single, fleeting glance in my direction, her face a mixture of anger and exhaustion. I felt a brief, hollow pang, not of pity for him, but of sorrow for the collateral damage his arrogance had caused. By the time the sun set, they were gone. The house stood dark and silent, a monument to a man who had gambled his home against his neighbor's resolve and lost spectacularly. The $28,000 didn't make me rich. I didn't buy a new car or take a lavish vacation. That money was never for me. It was for my land. It was restitution. The first check I wrote was to a landscape architecture firm. I didn't just want to plant trees. I wanted to heal the scar. They brought in 3 beautiful, semi-mature oak trees on flatbed trucks, each one craned carefully into place. They weren't as majestic as the ones I had lost, but they were a promise, a down payment on the next 100 years. The second check I wrote was to a fencing company. They tore out the old, rickety wire fence and installed a new one. It was a handsome, 6-foot-tall wooden privacy fence, its posts sunk deep in concrete. It was solid, unambiguous. It wasn't built out of fear, but out of respect. Respect for my property and for the peace I had fought so hard to reclaim. Now, when I sit on my back patio, the quiet has returned. It's deeper and more resonant than before. I can still see the stumps, which I've left as a reminder, but they are flanked by the new, hopeful branches of their successors. My sanctuary is whole again, its boundaries clear and defended. Mark thought my quiet nature was a weakness. He mistook my preference for solitude as a sign that I was a little thing who didn't deserve the space I owned. What he never understood is that the same meticulous, obsessive focus I pour into my work, the focus he mocked, is the same weapon I used to deconstruct his world. He brought a chainsaw to a battle of wits, and I brought a spreadsheet. My story is proof that you don't have to be the loudest voice in the room to be heard. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is gather your facts, know your rights, and present the bill. It's a feeling of empowerment I wouldn't trade for anything. If you've ever felt overlooked or underestimated, I hope my experience serves as a small reminder that the quiet ones are paying attention. If these are the kinds of stories that resonate with you, I hope you'll stick around for what comes next.